On today's show, we talk to internationally acclaimed pianist, educator, and entrepreneur Howard Rees. Known for his close association with jazz legend Barry Harris, we dive into Howard's past experiences in Barry's famous New York City workshops, the production of the legendary Barry Harris workshop videos, the popular We Are One jazz project for at-risk students in Canada, and much, much more. Stay tuned. You're listening to The Nikhil Hogan Show. Hello and welcome back to the Nikhil Hogan Show, the premier music interview show where we interview the top musicians in the world. I'm very happy to also introduce my co-host today, the talented drummer, composer, and educator, Christopher Jengalewski, who will be helping me on the show. Hey Chris, great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
Great. I'm delighted today to introduce our guest, Howard Rees. He's an internationally acclaimed pianist, educator, and entrepreneur. He's the producer of the acclaimed Barry Harris Workshop video series, volumes 1 to 3. He's the founder of Howard Rees's Jazz Workshops, Canada's oldest independent jazz school in operation for over 30 years. The Jazz Workshops have attracted more than 2,500 students from as far as Argentina, France, Holland, Trinidad, you name it, all over the world. He's the founder and president of the We Are One Jazz Project, an enormously successful music and mentoring program for at-risk students aged 8 to 13 in the Greater Toronto area. Howard, great to have you on the show.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to meet with you and Chris in this way, and I'm delighted that you would think of having me.
I can say for myself, the internet, really jazz education as a whole was kind of rocked by the introduction of this Barry Harris guy who just appeared on YouTube out of the blue a few years ago. And everybody was wondering, where did this guy come from? This guy is fantastic. And so when we started to dig a little further, we realized that he released these wonderful workshop DVDs, and you had been producing them in Canada. So let's start off first with a little bit of an introduction to your background. How did you meet Barry Harris, and how did you wind up in New York taking his workshops?
Well, let's see. It goes back to the mid-'70s, and I was a student in Toronto, and I knew who Barry was, and I had some of his records at that time, and I wasn't quite satisfied, let's say, with what I was getting at the school. I thought there was more to it than that somehow. And just around that time, I saw an ad in an old Downbeat magazine mentioning that Barry had this class happening in New York. And I just basically I sent him a note, told him I was this Canadian university student, wanted to come to study with him, and didn't get any reply, so I packed up and went. And that was in 1978. And his class had been going for 2 or 3 years at that point. And I thought I was going to go for 6 months. I had a little gig here at that time and with a trio, and saved my money. And, of course, I got there and it ran out about 6 days. And but I stayed for 7 odd years, something like that, and it was an addiction, but it was the best kind of addiction.
He's absolutely a wonderful educator, and now I want to ask you, was his style of teaching similar to what we see on the videos all the way back then?
Well, yes, absolutely. So he is a man who, as the video clips and so forth show, is I think he would agree with the term driven, and he is on a mission to make sure that somebody winds up playing properly, as he defines that term, and basically he is interested in passing along. He's a very important link in the jazz chain, let's put it that way, and he comes from Bud Powell, and he comes from Monk, and he comes from Charlie Parker, and Ellington and that sort of lineage. And so he is very interested in keeping that alive and keeping people knowing what the true meaning of what he is doing and how he views the music is about. And so he is single-mindedly on that mission, and has been. You know what? It's been 40 years this fall that I've known Barry, and I met him when he was 49 years old, and he has been on that. He's been like that ever. I can't think of a time when he hasn't been in that frame of mind.
Back in the 70s and 80s, do you remember any other people there of note, people who dropped in and out? Because I read in his history, people like Coltrane would stop by his house. He taught people like James Jamerson, Paul Chambers. So were there any named people who were swinging by his workshop back then?
Well, absolutely. It was a real focal point, actually, for the musicians. And that in itself was something that was new for me, going to New York. And that was, traditionally it was a little different in Toronto, I guess. And so, like the musicians, actually, when they weren't working themselves, they would swing by other people's gigs, and they would come to classes, and it was it was a real community that Barry developed there, and a community that is there now that he's developed and is thriving, and for that matter, there are now branches of that community worldwide, because, as you know, Barry has been doing a lot of traveling to different places for a long time. And these communities have developed in all over the place. It was a larger than life experience for me going there, and I sensed that it was for the other people who were in the class too. Like, everybody knew something very important was happening there, even if you didn't really understand what was going on at first. And Barry's language is different from generally how things are out there. He has a different way of describing and thinking about the music, the theory part of it, I should say.
It seems like he's really codified the language that musicians spoke, and he's mentioned that he's really been teaching all his life. Would you say that that's very authentic? All these concepts, were they as authentic as you can get?
Well, yes, the answer is yes. And I'm a believer in whatever your area of interest is. It makes sense to go back as far as you can get as close to the beginning of it as you can. And as far as jazz goes, and for you and I, that means Barry Harris. He's the oldest teacher. He has done exactly what you said. He's codified a language that was before we put it into video form, to tell you the truth, it was an oral tradition. I mean, he had codified it to that point, but still it had been an oral tradition that he had been teaching since his early days in Detroit, with guys like Jamerson and Charles McPherson, and Charles was his first student, by the way. And Charles and Lonnie Hillier, the great trumpet player. So I mean, this was sort of a sound of the day. I mean, if you listen to other piano players of Barry's, Barry's peers, let's say, you hear similar kind of sounds, and particularly in the harmony and stuff, and it really was, I think, the sound of the day. But Barry he codified it, and he really made a language out of it that one could sit and learn, and study. And it is a very strong methodology. It all makes sense. And that's the beautiful part about it, I think. The fact that it's not a cut and paste kind of system. Everything comes from someplace, and you can trace it back to square one, and 0.0 actually, and move forward from there. And that's very important when you're trying to learn something. But I think that personally, in terms of, as I was saying, in terms of learning whatever it is you're fascinated in, it's important to see what the people who are close to the flame, so to speak, really thought and think about what they're doing. And then to, as a newer musician, in this case, try to add to that. But it comes from really mastering what the originators we're talking about, or trying to master that, and that's a different experience than I think is a different experience than going to a school and learning from somebody that studied at the school and doesn't necessarily have that connection to the tradition in that kind of sense.
From the DVDs, Howard, I watched him, and he seems like really humble and pretty pretty humorous actually. And I mean, I'm a drummer, but I find I learn a lot from his DVDs as well. And can you speak on that? I mean, he seems very genuine, and I found when I was in school, there could sometimes be this like pretentious, vibe about jazz instructors, and he just doesn't really seem that way. If he likes what he hears, he'll just say, "Hey, that's about the best I heard right there."
I think you nailed that quite well, Chris. And for guys of Barry's, let's say Barry and his peers, people who were at that generation coming up, there were no schools. Obviously, I mean, the school was in the case of Barry, the school was his house when he was a teenager and in his early 20s. People would drop by, and basically he was known as the go-to guy for lessons by the time he was in his late teens, and so people would drop over to his place, and he had formulated parts of his theory at that point, mostly the improv stuff. But that was, those were his early days of teaching, and being a teacher at a school is a hard gig because schools are kind of under siege in a way. I mean, there was a time when I guess gigs started drying up a bit for guys, and people wondered how they would continue to make a living and so forth. And some of the better musicians at that time, maybe decided on a curriculum and things they should teach, and got together and started teaching at some schools. And at this day and age, I don't know what it's like in Singapore, but it's probably not that different from here and everywhere else. I mean, the schools in Canada, for instance, get government funding, and so that's on a per student basis, and you need everybody is interested in having as many PhDs on the staff as possible.
Yeah, it's very interesting you say that, Howard, because both Chris and I are Berkeley alum. And I can say for myself, Berkeley is a great school, but Barry's way of education, I mean, he has his own scale, for instance. I mean, there's a lot that's very different from what we normally see in contemporary education in most schools. Has he experienced some pushback in trying to get his curriculum? Because I think his curriculum is absolutely spot on, but it seems to be a minority at this present moment. Yes,
it is. But the thing is, you're absolutely right in noticing that, it's been a bit of a mystery for me. This is year 35 of my class in Toronto, and at the beginning, I used to bring Barry up here probably 2 or 3 times a year to give master classes to my students, and they were open to the public, and I would advertise them wide, all around for a couple 100 miles in each direction to different schools, and I would never get any response. And it was always a mystery to me, but why that was the case. But part of what I know to be true is that, how can I say this? If you're a teacher at a school, it's almost like being a doctor. And it's very hard to admit you don't know what you're saying, or it's hard to admit you don't know everything, especially when the school's in a situation of trying to attract students and stuff. I can see where that's a bit of a bind, and I don't say it's the case for everyone, but I know it's an issue. And the other thing is, there are not that many people who know enough about what Barry's talking about to actually teach it.
Especially his 6 diminished scale and his minor 6 diminished scale. This is totally unheard of in most modern jazz education courses. There was a very popular YouTuber who did a video on his major 6 diminished scale, and I felt he didn't quite really get to the source of the scale and its implications. He kind of had a surface treatment of it, and it's a very deep subject. I mean, you can really... that scale alone and what you can use with it, first of all, is difficult to explain if you can't do it yourself, but it seems like people are struggling to explain his concepts.
Well, I see. I go back with him long enough. I know I can remember when and where he first started introducing that scale. It was at a class in Holland, in the early 80s. And before then, Barry wasn't talking about harmony. And so what I'll say about Barry's system in general is it is an improvisational approach to improvising. You see, and that in itself is unique. That is a very different way of approaching the subject than what is generally out there. And it is also an improvisational approach to harmony. And so, rather than sitting up and coming up with a couple voicings that you like to play for a minor seventh chord, let's say, it's why these scales kind of make it wide open. And they get you to see another main kind of plank on Barry's harmonic platform is that the piano keyboard and the guitar fretboard, for that matter, are horizontal. And so he thinks of approaching chord playing in a horizontal sort of fashion, as opposed to building stacks of vertical chords and just kind of hitting them. It's a more fluid approach, orchestral in a sense. And that fluidity comes from knowing about these scales that I can't say he invented them, but he's put a name to them because these are old classical scales. And so using these scales, you get to move chords on them to create movement. But, there are two or three main purposes that I see for the scales. One is the movement aspect. Another is that it allows you, it gives you a very strong system for voicing chords, especially when you're trying to voice a melody and play the chord underneath the melody, for instance. It gives you a very strong structure for that. And it's also used in arranging. I remember having a chat with Jimmy Heath about it, and he said, yes, that's exactly what he teaches in his arranging classes. At that point in time, it's the sixth diminished chord theory. I don't know that he knew to call it that, but he knew that was the right thing to be doing.
So Howard, when you're teaching or putting together your jazz workshops, how do you integrate, or do you at all integrate, like orchestral theory or, just sort of standard jazz? I mean, because it seems like a good stepping stone to get into these process.
Well, the advantage for me is that it is my own school, and I get to audition people for the school, for the classes, and the truth is, at this point in time, I haven't thought of advertising in more than 20 years, and people just seem to find out about it, and I would say that at this point, the people who study with me and who are newer and just happen, whenever new people come by, they know what I'm doing, and so they kind of come knowing that much, right? So I don't really have to say, well, this is what I'm doing, and it's different in this way. They know that it's something different. They've already heard about it.
What is the audition like though for these students? Like, what do they have to do? Like, if people are listening, like, what could they do to get into your program? What would you be looking for?
Well, you know what? They just have to know the scales good. The dominant scale, dominant seventh scale, the major scale. As far as the improv goes, see, I have kind of three parts to my school, four, I guess. One, the main thing are the improvisation classes, and so the entry point of that is really knowing the dominant seventh scales really well, because that is what one winds up playing the most in terms of improvisation. And we just sort of work from there. We learn the connections between how things, what, I'll tell you one thing I've noticed of how, what I've noticed from students over the years, and that is that I see, because a lot of my students have already graduated from a music program and might be teachers or professional players themselves. And so I find that people coming to me might know a lot of things, but they haven't necessarily been shown how the things are related. And that's a key point in actually being know how to play properly, because you need to know how things are connected. And so that is a big piece of this whole deal in terms of talking about the theory, and it just makes for more efficient practice time, for instance. For instance, when we talk about chording and stuff, there's no such thing over an octave. So there's no such thing as 9s, 11s, 13s. I mean, we all know they exist, but the truth is they come from somewhere. It's not just an add-on above the octave. It actually comes from a reasonable place, and so we try to make connections like that for people to help really understand what's happening. So there's no kind of mysterious corner of the tune when it comes time to learn tunes and stuff.
Howard, I have a question from the online community that were curious. This is a thread of people who are going over Barry's stuff. And can I just read a question to you, and you want to just take it? So this is by
sure.
RLR Rhett and Christian M77. He said, the question is, in the DVD, Barry Harris is a special scale for playing over the minor. That turns out to be the minor 6 diminished scale. However, nowhere else, at least in the first set of DVDs, does he seem to use the minor 6 diminished scales for single note lines. Does Barry Harris suggest working out changes of a song by playing this scale over dominant chords from the important minor, or the scale over major chords? I think the main question is, does he think of that diminished 6 scale as a harmonic device separate from single line improvisation?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say yes, although it's used in both areas. The 6 diminished scales, major and minor, are 2 of 4 scales that Barry has developed for chording and for moving chords. And so the primary use of the minor 6 diminished scale is on tonic minor chords. And by tonic minor, I mean, if you're in the key of C minor, you're going to play that C minor scale with the flat 6 and the major 6. But there are other uses of the scale for improvisation. One of them is as the altered scale, and see, the minor 6 diminished is our altered scale. So, for instance, against the C dominant 7th chord, what you do is you wind up playing the D flat minor 6 diminished scale. And so if you take a look at that, if you compare that D flat minor 6 diminished scale to C, because you're going to play it over C7, you wind up with a flat 9, a sharp 9, a flat 5, a flat 13, and a natural 13. So it's actually all the notes we get in what most people think of the altered scale plus 1 additional. In the
DVDs, he mentions this over the minor, but I've seen other videos where he, for instance, in the second video, he talks about the harmonic minor scale. Does Barry want us to learn all the minor scales, like the natural minor, the melodic minor, and the melodic minor, and the harmonic? Does he want us to memorize all of these scales as well?
Well, you know what? It all increases your musicianship. The minor 6 diminished scale is a combination of the harmonic and melodic minor scales. And so, personally, I feel if you know the minor 6 diminished scale, you've got a lot covered right there. So that, and the only thing I would caution people about is that it seems pretty widespread, and mistakenly so. The minor 7th chord is often used or thought of as a tonic minor. For instance, if you're playing the blues in the key of C minor 7 may often be thought of as the final chord, or a tune in a minor key. That final chord, is going to be a minor 7th a lot of the time, especially in some fake books. And the truth is, a minor 7th chord is never a tonic chord. It's a 2, 3, or a 6. So it can't possibly be a 1. And, if you start looking at, harmony has to do with movement and resolution, or tension and resolution, or however you think of it. And if the minor 6 chord is the only chord with no diminished notes of the key in it. And that's why it is the most stable chord. And that's why it's a tonic. That's why it's a tonic chord.
Let me ask you another question, Howard. When in some of these videos, Barry mentioned offhand that he had a guy, Boverin, like a classical theorist that he would check his concepts against. And so Barry was very conscious about making sure his music functioned correctly, according to the proper rules. Is that right?
Well, I know Bodwin as well. Bodwin and Franz were the teachers in Holland, actually, and wonderful people and musicians. Franz is no longer with us, unfortunately, but I think it would be fair to say that Barry thought of these guys as close to peers as he found anybody to be, for him to be able to sit and discuss stuff. And so Barry's somebody who knows he's right. He's always looking for a fight, though. He's always looking for somebody who can challenge him properly, and he's quite happy to be proven wrong. But he does know that he's right, and he knows he's right because of the lineage and the origin of the music, which he is tied to. So I don't know if it was more that he was looking for these guys to kind of put their stamp of approval on it. I guess in a way, but it was more friendly, talking through different points of theory and them agreeing, or maybe they would have some other classical kind of term that they would use. But I can tell you that the 6th diminished scale is used in classical literature, and so it precedes Barry. It just makes perfect sense, and I mean it gives you the major 6th diminished scale anyway. It gives you two dominants: the one you need for the key, and the one you need to get to the relative minor. And so there's a lot of it's kind of like the hieroglyphics on the pyramids, right? I mean, it just gives you a lot of hidden information if you care to dig into it.
Because there's a video where he's talking about classical musicians, and he mentioned where he was saying there was a girl who played some Chopin or some classical piece, and she didn't know as he said, the changes to the song. And he said he was kind of stunned by that because, she's playing this wonderful piece and with all this beautiful harmony by Chopin and whatnot, and she couldn't explain the chords that were moving. And there's another video where he's kind of imitating Chopin, and it sounds very good, very authentic, and he's using his method, and it's working.
Yeah. Yes. Well, classical music is, in my experience, and I haven't had a great deal of experience learning classical music, although I've had some, and I practice Chopin today, but in my experience, it's a rare teacher who is interested or able, for that matter, to talk about an etude, let's say, in terms of, these are actually the underlying chord progressions, or here's the scales that are involved in putting this together, or so it's not the fault of any student. I think it's almost like it's taught as kind of high art, sort of, that has to be done just this way, and you don't ask about it. You just learn how to do it.
I want to switch over to the workshop videos, the volumes 1 to 3. I highly encourage everybody to buy these videos because, I mean, if I had known they had existed before I went to Berklee, I would have snapped them up instantly. And so this was a project that you conducted with Barry. I'd love to, and I'm sure a lot of people would love to know the behind the scenes of that video. Could you talk a little bit about the production of the video and how you guys planned it all out? There were some wonderful musicians on that video. And how was the recording process? Was it smooth? I want to know, is there any extra footage? I mean, there's not enough Barry in this world, I can tell you that.
That's very true. Well, you know what? As a student in Barry's class, I can remember occasionally he would just sort of pause and say, "Oh, I wish I had a video of, I need a video." He would say that once in a while, just as something I guess he thought maybe his students should have to be able to take home with them and follow on their own kind of thing. And when I came back to Toronto, I just through a series of good fortune, really, just found myself in a position where we could actually get this together. And so it was a series of, we had 2 weekends, one in the spring and one in the summer. And we had Barry come up here, and we had a TV crew from one of the TV stations, and used a rehearsal room at one of the universities, and I had a friend at that time who was he was an amateur musician, but a business guy, and just a complete believer in what Barry was about, and he graciously and generously put up the money for us to do it. And so kind of all these components came together, and that was in I guess 1991 or two. And then the second one, it just occurred to me somewhere around 10 years later that in that period of time between the first two volumes, that's when Barry started developing and talking about his harmonic side. And not that he wasn't playing it all that time, but he finally put the language to it and was actively teaching it. And so, it just occurred to me that it was time to do part two, because part one, kind of has some very preliminary thoughts on the six diminished stuff, but part two really nails it, and it is the complete harmonic system, at least the main ingredients fleshed out very well. And so that was a similar process, and Barry was very happy to have the opportunity, I think, to formalize the stuff, and so it's just been. I just feel incredibly fortunate to have had a small part in that and be part of the learning process in general. It's just an ongoingly wonderful part of my life.
We were discussing how he interpreted classical music, and how a lot of young just musicians in general, they don't really know what they're playing. So they can memorize something, which is, there's some utility in that, and that can be impressive, but Absolutely. They don't really understand the connection of what they're doing. And I wonder, you talked a bit earlier about your classes and how a lot of these students already more or less understand these things. How would you suggest going about explaining this to someone who can play, but maybe they're not like this girl in his class many years ago? She didn't understand the changes she was playing, yet there's a high level of talent there. How would you go about giving them this information?
Well, I think that I think first of all, the music comes first, and so somebody has to fall in love with the music, and just period, like the standards. The greatest players, somebody has to kind of be in that position to begin with, and then have an interest in digging in themselves and figuring out how that's done, or which is often the greatest challenge for the person that comes from the classical tradition, and learns perhaps at a very high level how to read what's in front of them, but doesn't necessarily know what to do without the music, and so I just tend to explain it the way it was explained to me, and that is that this is the jazz comes from classical music. Barry has said this. Actually, I think it might have been Baldwin in Holland who first said it this way, and that was, he made the observation that when classical music, when improvisation, I should say, stopped in Europe via the classical music, the improvisation bug jumped across the ocean and there it took root in the U.S. And from there now it's worldwide, of course. But it is a continuation of classical music, and it is the same kind of raw materials, meaning these 8-note scales that people like Bach and Chopin were most likely making use of in their compositions.
Howard, I wanted to ask you, it's quite clear that Barry loves Bud Powell and Charlie Parker. Could you describe the influence of Bud on Barry? Because I think very few pianists can really play like Bud, and Barry seems to really know how to do it. And Barry actually knew Bud, right, a little bit, like when he came back from France. And I read in that Francis Poidras biography, he used to help him and he used to watch his concerts. Did Barry ever talk about Bud? And did Bud ever talk to Barry? I know Barry liked Bud, so did he ever mention any anecdotes, especially like with Charlie Parker? We all know the one where he sat in with Charlie Parker, and that was a very nice experience. But what about like Bud?
I've asked Barry a little bit about that, actually, and from what I gather, he didn't really have a full-on relationship with Bud. I know Barry very much thought of Bud as a mentor, and I know that Bud loved what Barry was doing and his playing, and I don't even know how much they hung out. I know that I believe the story was that Bud was responsible for Barry moving into the residence with the Baroness and with Monk, and shortly after Barry moved to New York, and that's where Barry lives today. But I don't think they really had like a regular relationship, where it was different with Barry and Monk in a way, because
they lived together, right?
Well, that's right. For about 10 years, they both shared this house, and Barry has more stories, about the interactions with Monk. I guess it makes sense that they were living in the same place. But I know one that Barry will mention, and I know is dear to his heart, and that was on one occasion. Monk and Barry, there were two Steinways in the room actually, and so they just sat up for several hours and just traded choruses on a tune back and forth.
I think I know this one. This is My Ideal, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, and that was a very high point for Barry.
Would it be fair to say they were good friends? That they knew each other they were really good friends?
I think that would be a fair assessment. Yeah.
Now, Howard, let's talk about We Are One, the jazz project. I think it's really an amazing project that you do in Toronto. And
thank you.
It's really, I've seen some of the videos on YouTube. All the press it's gotten is very well deserved. I think Chris and I, as educators here in Singapore, we're very interested in programs like this, because we would love to bring jazz to Singapore. And I'd love to know how you started this project with the resources that you had, and how you got kids to perform music at such a high level for their age. I mean, really 8 to 13, and playing really what amounts to like bebop heads and difficult chord progressions. And I'm sure a lot of educators would love to know, how do you get young kids to get excited about a program and really getting into something like jazz?
Well, you know what? I'll preface that by saying that I came back to Toronto somewhat reluctantly in the 80s, right? I really thought I was going to live out my life in New York. But when I came back here, I took the opinion that one has to be a bit of a pioneer, and that this is a big place, lots of people, and there are going to be people who will be attracted to the right stuff. And I knew that I had some of the right stuff after those years of concentrated study with Barry. And so that's the preface. Now, I've been doing the We Are One for I guess 10 years now. And how it started really is, as a student in Barry's class, all the pianos, Barry would put on these mega concerts in New York once a year with all his peers. And Barry has written all these amazing orchestrations of standards and a number of his own compositions. And so the concert would involve a jazz orchestra with these incredible soloists, and a string section and an adult choir, and all the piano students were obliged to be in the adult choir. So that's where I got the music from. And then at one point, I remember there were a couple guys in the choir who were high school teachers, and at one, a couple different points in time, they brought us a contingent of students to the concert, like appeared on the concert with the adult choir, and it was a really beautiful thing. And years later, I was back in Toronto, and really I was kind of just cleaning some stuff, books and stuff up. And I rediscovered this folder of all this beautiful music. And I thought, the world deserves to hear it, or the Toronto world deserves to hear it. And, it's no secret. I'm sure this is worldwide. Funding for the arts, arts education is kind of pretty close to the bottom of the list in a lot of school boards, and it certainly is in these parts. And I thought, well, hey, this would be a wonderful kind of way of embracing this music and making it available for young kids. And
Howard, how big are, like for instance, you do these classes once a week. So how big are the classes once a week? How many kids are we talking about?
well, on average, it's been in the neighborhood of 300 children.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we work with, it's a choir. We form a choir with all these kids. And it's kind of two parts. Once a week, we'll send in a vocal coach and an accompanist to each participating class. And the class might be 20 or 25 students. And they'll have, like a vocal coaching session where they kind of go through some of the finer points of the repertoire, but also do some vocal tune-up stuff and learn some basic stuff about reading music. And then the other part of it is once a week there will be a sort of a mass choir rehearsal where all the participating classes will meet at a central location, generally a high school in the area we're working in. And there will be a choir rehearsal with however many kids we're working with, which is often, one year we had 420, and there were 550 kids that applied that year. And we had to sadly turn down a number of students simply because the concert hall didn't hold that many people. And, there were only like 1,000 seats in the concert hall. And, it's open to the concerts are the program finishes with a public concert, which is open to the public. But, we make sure that the families and parents of the participating students get in. And so, we had to be mindful of how many seats there were in the place. And so that was our restriction on that in that year. But no, you know what? It's a joy to get to the first rehearsal and stand up and say, we are going to be learning Canada's national music, jazz. and so I just present it like that. And you know what? Aside from the music being beautiful, Barry he is a very skillful, lyric writer. And so the lyrics of these songs have beautiful lyrics and very deep meaning for the kids. And I'm amazed, to tell you the truth, I'm amazed, and it happens every year. We have one song that is sort of a kid's tune. It's called the Bigfoot Kangaroo. And there's a couple up-tempo tunes, and then there are 2 or 3 ballads. And one of the ballads is called These Are the Things We Need. And it's a pretty heavy tune. I mean, it's a beautiful, arrangement and song, but the lyrics are very powerful. And when I go to the class and I say, okay, what do you want to warm up with? The kids, they always will choose the ballads. So I know it gets them. I know there's something about the music that the kids relate to. And yes, you're right in noting that it's pretty sophisticated music for children. But you know what? Sometimes I think we underestimate what children can do.
Do you think young kids can learn like difficult jazz heads and some of these tunes with complex chord progressions or even rhythm? In my experience teaching, I mean, there are some, it takes a lot of work, but then I'm always curious as to whether they really kind of grasp the depth of it. It takes time. I mean, I can think back as a student, kind of remembering the day where these things really started to become kind of fully realized. And, I guess, like, what do you feel, how do you feel about that? I know there's exceptions, there's always outliers, but generally speaking, do you think kids could learn some of this bebop stuff 10, 11, 12 years old?
I know they can. And I'll say, it reminds me actually of what I was mentioning a minute ago about, when I was part of Barry's productions in New York as a student, and there were a couple of other students who, would bring in their young students that they were teaching at school. I remember this one guy in particular, his name's Lenny Azzarello, and who I've recently re-met after all these years. Beautiful guy and piano player. But he came to Barry with this issue, and the issue was that he couldn't get his students to sing anything. And it's it's a bit of an odd age, it's a bit of an odd age because, it's kind of on the border of when the kids start thinking, well, they're too cool for this,
right,
or it's not cool enough, or, Particularly the boys, or not always the boys, though girls will get into that too. But Barry said, "Why don't you try some of the bebop tunes with them?" And so he brought in O. Henry, and I think it was Anthropology as well that he brought in, and they started loving it. and those were the tunes that the kids sang at the concert. And so whether they got the rhythm or whether they got the meaning of the lyrics or whatever it was that was their awakening. And so I've we've worked with 3,000 kids in the We Are One project over 10 years, and I can tell you that the feedback we get is just, it's unbelievable, man. You wouldn't believe it. We've had a kid who stopped stuttering. We had a kid who came and sang, because we teach them about the blues form as part of it, and they get to write lyrics, and we teach them a little bit about scat singing, and there's opportunities for scat singers and blues groups to sing their own lyrics at the concert, which is always a high point of the concert. And we had one kid who got up at a rehearsal, and actually did a scat solo with our trio. And at the end of it, went back to his seat, and there was like 300 kids like clapping like crazy. And I thought, well, that's nice. At the end of the rehearsal, the teacher came over to me with her mouth open, and she was in shock because she said, nobody's heard this kid speak since the beginning of school. Like about in 6 months, he'd been mute, hadn't said a word about anything to anybody, and something got him. So, it's very powerful stuff. And again, I'll just say, we can't underestimate what kids are capable of. And at that age, they're like sponges at that age. They'll take up whatever you put in front of them.
That leads me to my next question. What age do you think is appropriate for a kid to really start improvising, like, in jazz or taking it to the next level?
Well, it's an interesting question. I'd hate to ruin it with an answer. No, it's an excellent question. And you know what? It obviously is going to depend somewhat on the individual. I mean, I remember I taught at Stanford University one summer, and there was one. They gave me a 3-hour theory class, and I thought, well, who is going to come to this? But there was, it was at 9 a.m, right? And anyway, it was packed, and most kids, I shouldn't say kids. They weren't kids. Most people were in their early 20s and older, but there was one guy who was about 16 and very, very, like an exceptional kind of person. And, didn't even seem like he was paying too much attention in the class. At the end of the 3 hours, every day he'd come over and play on the piano everything I'd done. And so it's really just he was quite exceptional, but I mean, it depends on the person. Largely, but the bottom line is, you never stop learning. It's not about learning new stuff all the time. I'm not a believer in that. I'm a believer in the tools that Barry has as you said, Nick, codified. You learn those. There's not that many principles. There might be half a dozen key points that the whole thing hangs on. You learn those really good, and then you start digging down. It's not about going out, you dig down deeper. And you just spend the rest of your life doing that. And so, it's not the 5-year-old child that's going to start in deep that way, but I know lots of kids that like playing around on the piano, and that's their improvisation. And they might obviously not know intellectually too much what's going on, but the connection is that they need to know they can do it, and need to know it's fun. And, that's a good start.
All right, let me ask you these quick questions then. So how much practice do you recommend a student do a day?
Well, I'll preface that by saying I tell my new students, be careful because this will ruin your life. And, but in a beautiful way. And so, I know when I was in my late teens and early 20s, just prior to going into New York, what I did was I had two full-time jobs. I worked all day and then I worked all night. And when I came, and I did that I would do that kind of thing for a few months, as long as I figured it was going to take to save some money so that I could just stay home and practice all day until the money ran out. And that, in those days, maybe, I don't know, it was relative costs, but I might stay for a year and just practice all day, like 8 or 10 hours. And when, money ran out, I'd go get the jobs again and start it all over again. So, the thing is, there's a lot there and there's a lot to take in, and it happens over a long period of time. This is not a quick, easy thing. If it was, more people would do it. But the thing is to organize what you're doing and to know what's important to focus on. And that's where I find that Barry's method it's second to none. I mean, that's what it will do. It organizes the material. As I said earlier, there are no cut and paste kind of jobs. Everything makes sense, and everything comes from somewhere and leads somewhere else. And so, a simple thing, for instance, most people know a diminished scale, but they don't know that there are 4 related dominants to each diminished scale.
Yeah, when I was in Berkeley, it was they said whole half or half whole.
Yeah.
And that was what they taught me.
It's the same scale, the half whole. It's just that he puts a meaning to it. There's more depth involved than just half whole. There's a diminished chord. There are 3 different diminished chords, as you know, and there are 4 keys related to each one, or 4 dominants from each key. And one quick way you can find them is by lowering each note of the original diminished chord by a half step. And the note that you've lowered, like let's say we have the B diminished chord, and you lower the B to B flat, well, now that's a B flat dominant 7th. If you lower the D to D flat, you get D flat 7. F to E, you get E 7, and A flat to G, you get G 7. Well, now you've got a family of 4 dominants that are related to each other through this common diminished. And so there you get a couple things. First of all, one, as anybody other than a piano player, but including piano players, need to realize is that scales outline chord movements. Because, see, there's a lot of people practicing scales and don't know they're actually practicing chord movements. And so what you realize is that, B flat 7 to G 7, well, that's like playing D minor 7 flat 5 to G 7 by running those 2 scales together. If you run the B flat 7 scale to D flat 7, that's going to the tritone of the G 7. So you see, if you learn to organize what you're doing, you can, who's got 10 hours a day to practice? Not too many people, but you can get a lot accomplished in 15 or 20 or 30 minutes if you know what to do, and if you know how to go about doing it, and if you know the context that you're practicing in, So one thing I do in my classes is we learn those sort of connections, and we make up what I call like a little scale map for each song. So you know how to cover the song by scales. And if you do it right, somebody could walk by and know what song you're practicing because you're sounding the harmony by running the correct scales over the changes.
It's brilliant. I mean, all of this information, Howard, you've really codified it so well in the DVDs and and also Jazz School Online, which is a website that you run that has all these lessons that I really encourage people to go and check out and subscribe to. It has everything that Howard is saying, and I mean, there's so much, like you said, Howard. Once you really plumb the depths of it, there's so many lessons there. So everybody, please check out that website. Howard, just before we end off, I have 2 really rapid fire questions for you. Now,
okay.
Let's talk about that foot, the 2 and the 4. Now, Barry does not like that tapping on 2 and 4, right? And so
right.
Now when we're practicing with the metronome, how would Barry kind of do that with the metronome? Does he practice with the metronome?
I don't know that he does. He probably has one. I'm sure he has in the past, but I can tell you personally, I've learned, and I do mean I've had to learn to put that metronome on 1 and 3, and I have learned also to tap my foot on 1 and 3, or sometimes I'll tap it on all 4 quarter beats. But what that does for you is it makes the 2 and 4 feel like the ups, and that is a very different way to feel things, and it's very important and very integral to this music because, when things aren't working out rhythmically and you're playing or in a group that you're playing with, it's because people aren't really paying attention to the upbeats. A lot of the time that's the case. And so it makes the music breathe, and it's just a very important piece that, Barry kind of does a funny thing with it on the video, and I've seen him do this in classes too, where he says, well, if you tap your foot on the 2 and 4, what are you going to do with your hands? You can't.
Well, what would he say to like a drummer where you're practicing? I guess it could be really anything, and you could use a metronome in a bunch of different ways. It could be on just the first beat of a measure 4/4, but I was always told it just helps you reinforce your left foot hitting the backbeat, hitting the 2 and 4. I like what you said though. That really does help the time breathe. And I mean, I would personally probably do both anyways, like just to kind of get that different perspective. But do you think there's is it any different for a drummer to maybe use the 2 and 4 with the click just to work on their time, or just 1 and 3 just the same?
You know what? I can't. I'm certainly no expert on that specific question, but I liken it to the clave in Cuban and other Spanish music and stuff. And that is kind of the central heartbeat. And that's how, and so I see it as you play off of it rather than play it, And so tapping your foot on the 1 and 3 really allows you to feel the 2/4 in a different way. And I don't know, it's still kind of work in progress for me, I have to say, and I just would encourage people to try it out. The one thing I'll say about the upbeat and for drummers and bass players in general, is it's not used enough. You have to play what I call an exposed upbeat. And exposed upbeats are notes that don't have a downbeat right after them. So that would be meaning another note. It would be something that's tied, or So basically, you play like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2, 3, 4, and 2, 3, 4, and what that does is it does away with the 1. So in other words, it makes the whole feel of the music more circular, and I think that's what needs to happen, rather than these sort of artificial, measures, which are vertical kind of structures again. But doing away with the 1 helps round it out, and I think that is a rather hip way to do it. And I think bass players need to think about that too.
Like more over the bar line phrasing for bass players and drummers, so not always nailing the 1 every. No, you mentioned that for bass players too, so not hitting the root, or just I guess anticipating it, or what would you suggest for bass players?
Well,
if you're hitting
I would practice that upbeat. You see, we put a lot of attention on the downbeats, but the truth is this music is about upbeats, and we need to give them equal voice. So as a bass player, I would be practicing stuff like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2, 3, 4, and I would practice all of them. I'd go 1 and 3, 4, 1 and 3, 4. I'd practice
so you like
1,
put all the
2,
different
and 4.
variations of those rhythms, and
I would recommend practicing walking through a tune, but with that kind of rhythmic underneath going on, and the drummer the same thing. And you see, when the drummer and bass player practicing together, it's not that you have to be playing the same upbeat. You can play different ones, and they complement each other. And what it does is it makes the time feel very solid, but at the same time very spacious, because that's the job of the upbeat. It gives that little breath of fresh air. And it's a very different sound.
Howard, you have a standing invitation to come to Singapore anytime you want, and we will just give you a tour.
Thank you.
You'll have all the best local food here, the sunny weather. I know it's cold up there, right, in Canada. I know it's really cold.
Well, It's actually pretty hot right now, but thank you so much. I would love to do that.
Yeah, come down. Like if it gets, I suggest? Come down when it's winter time. Just come down here, and
okay,
we'll give you a tour of the place, and we'd love to have you and host you. And it's been such a treat to talk to you. I mean, what a wonderful honor for us. Talk about some projects you have coming up for this year and next year.
Well, I'm very excited about. I'm currently exploring the possibility of expanding the We Are One project to outside of Toronto, and that's. I won't say anything in detail because it's in the works, but it looks like it might happen, and I'm very excited about the possibility of bringing it to another community. And that's sort of the focus for the summer just now, I just wish that I'll have another 50 years to dig into this beautiful music.
Absolutely. Well, Howard, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really hope to talk to you again in the future. All the best with the We Are One. It's a fantastic program, and I really hope to talk to you soon again.
Thanks so much. And Chris, nice to make your acquaintance as well, and all the best to both of you.
Thank you so much, Howard. Have a great day.
You too. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening to my interview with the great Howard Rees. As you probably guessed by now, I am an enormous fan of Barry Harris, and so it was a huge pleasure to be able to chat with Howard. I really hope you enjoyed the show, and I'd be so grateful if you took a moment to subscribe, rate, and review my show on iTunes. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you at the next show.